my pleasure today to have two really important people, one presenting and the other one chairing. I'm going to start with the chair, and then the chair will introduce the presenter. So the chair of the event is Dr. Mark Monaghan, who is, Mark, I'm never going to be able to say the long title of your department correctly in the right order, but you're the head of Department of Social Policy, Criminology and Sociology in the University of Birmingham. Was that the right order?
Not quite. But the right subject in the wrong order. The
right subject, there you go. Well, at least. And Mark is an old friend and colleague. We did PhD together in the School of Sociology and Social Policy, both with Ray Boston. So we have a lot of stories together, and he's an old realist, and he's the co-author of doing realist research that we published a couple of years ago. So I'm delighted, Mark, that you could be here today chairing this event, because now, obviously, as head of a school, you have a lot of knowledge around underrepresented communities in higher education. So over you go. You can introduce the speaker.
All right. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, as a head of department, I feel pretty de-skilled at the moment. So this is quite a nice welcome relief to be part of this. And as Anna says, I'm a reader in criminology and social policy at the University of Birmingham, and head of department of social policy, sociology and criminology. That's the order. Yeah, really pleased to be here, not presenting but chairing the session. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Adam Formby from York St John University, who's going to be talking to us about underrepresented communities in higher education, a realist evaluation. So I think this is based on some work you've been doing over a number of years, Adam. So Adam's a social scientist and a methodologist with a background in social policy analysis, various sort of broad research and teaching interests, but primarily relate to the sociology and social policy of youth, realist methods, and access to higher education. So Adam has 9 years of experience in mixed methods teaching and research. Started working with evaluations and on evaluations around 2015, and has had positions in the past at SPSW in York, so social policy and social work in York, University of Leeds, where Adam joined as a teaching fellow. I sat on his interview panel, and it was one of the best appointments we made in my time there. Adam's written several articles and reports using sort of realist evaluation approaches, particularly for sort of Go Higher West Yorkshire. And he's published in the Journal of Widening Participation. He's got some publications coming out this month, so look out for them. So this current project that Adam's going to talk about is in its last year now, with the final reports due to be published shortly. And he's hopefully this work will, have a significant impact, and he's feeding into discussions at the office for students. So I'll hand over to you now, Adam. I'm really looking forward to this, and yeah, good luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna and Mark, for introducing me, and that's fantastic. And thank you all for joining us. It's fantastic to hear people from around the world and so on. If my microphone cuts out, can you just let me know? It's not the best sometimes, so please put your hand up, and I will just quickly sort it out if it goes wrong. That was also, this is my second lecture today. I did a 3-hour one this morning, so I hope I'm still somewhat comprehensive as this goes on, to be honest. So please excuse me if not. But as I say, thank you for me. I'm going to kind of pitch this today at people who are new to realism. I know we've got people who are starting PhDs, for instance, who are kind of figuring out some of this work for the first time. We've also got people like Ray here who know a fair bit about it. Obviously, there's obviously a need to think about the different ways we pitch this to different audiences. So please excuse me if it's one way or the other, but I'll try to kind of hit a bit of a middle ground there. As Mark said, yeah, I'm a social scientist, primarily social policy analysis. And I started doing this type of work around about 2014-15. And the project which I want to talk about today actually was my first real, I guess, introduction to doing realist evaluation for Go Higher West Yorkshire. And it's a type of work which it's really I love because it allowed me to analyse the kind of lived experiences of young people, the kind of complexities around their trajectories to work and HE a bit more. So just to quickly introduce what I do, I do realism evaluation for Go Higher. I also do work across the board in other areas. I've just got a specialist out in people, place and policy around youth labour markets, which is all regressions and statistics, not quite so realistic, that one. But the other work I do has been, I'm currently working with North Yorkshire Police to talk about some of their initiatives and do some risk evaluation for them, particularly think about evidence-based policing, which they have their own take on. And of course, the work I'm going to talk about today, the work with Go Higher West Yorkshire. And just to give some context to this work somewhat, this is work which I would definitely say it's obviously an international focus, the access to higher education and so on, but there's kind of a need to just kind of have an international audience just to kind of stipulate and explain what widening participation in the UK context in particular. So I'm just aware of that. So just bear with me if I don't want to lose you in the kind of vernacular of the. What we're talking about today is the kind of policies and initiatives that are aimed at reaching out to young people in their communities to try and get them into higher education in particular. And this is what Go Higher West Yorkshire has been focused on doing. And just to say this as well, like I'm presenting this today, but the work put into this, there's 100 people who work behind this on this £50 million scheme that are doing incredible work. And I'm just here talking about it, playing a small role in it. And very much it's them who deserve credit for anything good that comes from it. I'll take the blame, obviously, for all the bad things, but they're the ones who took all the fantastic work. I just want to stress that. And what we're going to talk about today is the kind of policies and realization that helped us figure out how to kind of run this process evaluation. I've got 3 parts of this. I'll talk about a bit of a context, firstly, a bit about, what this is, why it's happened, how it's going to be, and how Ray got involved in this as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. Go Higher itself, what we've done, and then finally, I'll sum up the 2 articles we've had recently on this, which one is coming out this month, another came out as part of a special issue for the Journal of Widening Participation this summer. So they're available. Very happy to send them to people. If not, I think they're part of the paywall, so I'll send them to you if you. And basically, what I want to do with this today is give you a bit of an overview of these different looking at. The first thing I want to talk about is just this kind of contextual analysis of access to HE and the land. As many of you will be aware, in the UK context, in the social sciences, access to university in the UK is deeply socially stratified. To such an extent that we've seen kind of multiple governments over several years try to do something to ameliorate the types of inequalities that have been there for a long time. Particular developments in this regard include university implementing what we call widening participation strategies as part of their access agreements. We have about £832 million spent annually by HE sector on such initiatives. And these things can range from your classic campus visits to things in the community, to information settings, to varying different types of resource over the student life cycle, basically. And this has become, I guess, a hot topic in many ways, but basically because of the sheer level, the kind of extent of inequality that we're talking about in particular. And the government have 2 targets. They wanted to double the proportion of underrepresented young people in HE by 2020, which I think they're just about on target to do. And they also wanted to increase BAME groupings as well, double that as well. So this was a kind of effort to try and mitigate these inequalities in different ways. And this background is quite important to us because we try to think about the broader space of participation. In the UK, I would say there's kind of 3 parts of it, and others might say there's even more than this. I would say what we're going to talk about today is access to HE, the targeted measures at secondary school, at college, and the wider community. There's also the kind of WP agenda within higher education itself. So that's where we try to think about the ways in which the kinds of lived experiences of young people at university, access to placements, access to the types of things that could help them through those processes. And of course, as university has massified and become much larger in the UK context, we now have 55% of young people going into university. These issues are quite pertinent. And lastly, the final stage of it is a graduate labour market. How we support underrepresented graduates in transition to work, and that's what I did my PhD in originally. So going probably full circle to that to some extent at some point. So yeah, this is something we'll talk about one part of this, but there's a need to think about these broader discussions and locate these debates in a much wider debate, I suppose, around how we help young people in these situations. And with this in mind, I'm going to kind of just quickly run through a bit of background on what WP looks like. I'm just aware that international audiences might have something quite different in their varying context. So I just want to kind of talk about what this is a little bit. And what we're kind of referring to here is activities that support learners throughout their educational trajectories. The career-focused stuff, information events, one-to-one mentoring, personal statement stuff, lots of things which are quite particular to the UK HE system, and lots of types of things which we can evaluate to figure out if they're working or not, with varying results and so on. So we have essentially traditional WP kind of looks like something like this. It's kind of talks, parental engagement, residentials, your kind of summer residentials and so on. Go into university for a few days and such like. Things where we try to identify traditionally the needs of people and then try to use resources to essentially fill gaps where possible. And WP as a kind of as a type of sector has really grown in prominence to do these things. What I'm going to talk about today is some of this stuff, but I'm going to talk about how some of these resources change in community settings and how we use realist evaluation to analyse what they are a little bit. And part of this development, with this government saying we need to do all this, was the establishment of UniConnect. And this was essentially it has a bit of a run in here, but there was a kind of acknowledgement by government about these different inequalities, and there was demand to essentially do something about them. They wanted more WP, better evaluation of that WP, and more kind of understanding of the causal explanations as to what's happening, what's going on. And this is the kind of people who work in the sector were dealing with these things quite a lot of the time sometimes. This happened in 2017, and the kind of main targets of this is years 9 to years 13, so ages between 13 and 18, schools and colleges, so year 9 upwards. And we see what the kind of argument behind all this was. So analysis was done kind of in 2014-15 government, where they identified gaps at all levels. Essentially gaps where people should be going to university based on their GCSE results, but we're not, essentially. And we could locate geographically where these wards were, where these gaps were. And through that, we could start targeting provision much more in a much more kind of a much more precise way, I suppose. And this is where what UniConnect was there to do, and why it kind of came up in this way. And the argument is, if there's not an explanation for it, it's got to be these forms of inequality, social and cultural inequality, that explain these gaps, which I'll come back to in a moment, because this is key for why realist evaluation is so useful in this context. And basically, whilst all this is going on, there was this kind of push for more WP evaluation, right? More stuff to evaluate. This kind of the classic what works best stuff, best practice, across the board, share it all out and such like. And this is really important. I mean, and this is Les Ebden, who was a kind of social mobility star in 2014. And the argument is the government are also saying we want to see good value, basically, as well, for what they're doing. So we need to think about that a little bit as well. And one of the things that I think was quite fascinating about that discussion is that realist evaluation can allow us to go a little bit further in one sense, because rather than just thinking about what works best, we can start asking some more precise questions about that. Current widening participation strategies aim to be smarter, they want more demonstrable impact, to improve access and participation. They want randomized control trials, to be honest, a lot of the time. And as myself and I think Greg and a few people in the chat who work in WP will tell you, there's a lot more going on with open social systems than just throwing RCTs at them. And of course, the challenges around this, different cultures and practices around WP, to think about what these things are, to get knowledge about how we figure out these questions. So what works? But for us, we'll try to push beyond that. What works in different ways in different institutions, communities, and how does it do so? And how do we implement these changes, especially around introducing things like widening participation in FE colleges, further education colleges that are quite new to that, aren't perhaps used to that type of approach. So it was also introducing those resources, but also thinking about what do we do about these reasonings? How do we change this stuff? How do we get further with it? So this is the key point around what we wanted to do with this. And Go Higher West Yorkshire UniConnect, which covers all of West Yorkshire, was a kind of way of analysing some of these issues. And in particular, there are there's a little story about how this all began. I was literally getting printing out. As Mark said before, I used to work at Leeds. It's a wonderful school. I'm going to say thank you for inviting me back. Even though I'm not back, it's nice to see everyone again. And I remember being at a photocopier and running into Ray, and he said, "Oh, I've just spoken to someone at Go Higher West Yorkshire. It's a really great initiative. I think this could be something that you could be interested in." And as someone who does a lot of work on sociology of youth, it was just a dream. I was like, this is amazing. This is exactly what I wanted. Ray, my colleague, Dr. Gemma Basham, I don't know if Gemma's in the chat, but Gemma was one of the originators who really came up with the realist idea, and with Ray put it all together, which was amazing as well. And they kind of introduced me to it, and I tried to help them figure it out, particularly Gemma, as we kind of developed it. So what we're trying to do with this was capture the complexity of WP practice, figure out how we can kind of target different types of underrepresented communities across the region. And we've seen in recent years, not just us, many other groups kind of using realist approaches as well. Liz Thomas has done some amazing work around institutional approaches, which is fantastic. There's some great work being done by my colleague Greg Brown. I don't know if Greg's in the chat. He's done some brilliant work as well on this, especially around realist synthesis work, which is great. And we've also seen work being done internationally as well, which I'll come back to a bit later. So it's great to see a lot of people taking this stuff on, which is what we want to see. And this is kind of our awards, so what we're looking at. So those who might be unfamiliar with the kind of areas that we're talking about here, we're talking about Bradford and Leeds and Wakefield. So these are 3 cities in Northern England that have got quite substantial but can I hide that for you? Sorry, I just on the chat. Is that okay, Lorne? Apologies, I didn't realise that was there. Is that all right? Moved it for you. Yeah, what we tried to do with this was think about these different localities. As you said in our initial reports, there was lots of huge sociocultural diversity in these areas, and why risk evaluation is so good was its focus on context and kind of elucidating why still people working in these different kind of contexts. For instance, in Bradford, we can see from our initial analysis that parents had much more influence on the kind of decision making and processes around young people and learners. In Wakefield, which is more an old mining town, it's a kind of post-industrial kind of context. University seemed geographically quite far away. There wasn't a university around. Whereas in Leeds, there's a big university in Leeds that you can see from quite a long way away from. And how these little kind of things played out was quite interesting to us. And we wanted to see, could we kind of catch find what these things are, and of course identify that in our evaluation. And that's what these papers try to do, basically, try to kind of capture some of these things, using some of the qualitative work we've done over the past couple of years. And of course, just to say, these contexts have more diversity beyond that. There is an infinite amount of, I couldn't even begin to tell you how the differences between Eastern and Hemsworth and so on, but we really, what we want to do is get our staff into these communities to figure out how we could kind of shape policy within them, and then how we can meet need, and try to avoid what we call a deficit model, where there's kind of almost like a patronizing, throwing financial information at people that they don't really want. Instead, actually approach them on their terms, treating people as people, basically. So there was a kind of, a way of trying to think about why this was important to us. So this is our areas, as you can see, and this is, there's about 29 in total. We call these Polar 1 areas. The gaps and the analysis I alluded to before, we have this for every every ward in the UK, and different types of partnerships, UniConnect partnerships, are doing some of the things to us and trying to figure out ways that we can reach people in these communities. So why risk evaluation? It allowed us to start thinking about some of these kind of subtleties and ways that were quite interesting. I already mentioned the kind of growth of Liz Thomas's work, but there are other things as well that that were really quite interesting. In many aspects, the kind of commitment to real problems was great. Method neutrality is great. For someone who's a methodological pluralist in some aspects, I just do methods that I need to do. It really helps that I can go from different thing to thing a little bit. And really, this allowed us to really think about using practitioners' kind of viewpoints, why our assumptions were kind of wrong or right or so on, But the big thing was this kind of targeting of existing gaps at ward level. We could see what these gaps were, and we could then use risk evaluation to start pinpointing them a bit more accurately. And rather than randomized control trials and other things, we have a way of having another explanation, which we think gives us hopefully something a bit unique, a bit more interesting. So that's why we decided to do it. Now, I'm just going to really do a quick reminder for risk evaluation. Again, please excuse me. A lot of people know much more than I will ever know about this, so I apologise before I completely butcher it and explain this all the wrong ways. But again, for people who are just starting out, this is for them as well a little bit. This is a scientific model explanation. This little image that Ramses put together with all their images, which are great fun, by the way. I think we explained it well. It's kind of pulled between constructivist and positivist traditions, and we're not quite like the positivists. We don't just hypothesis build and test. We're not quite like the relativists who just do the deductive work about how people frame the world. We kind of sit between a little bit, and of course Ray's work and the recent work that Nick and Joe and Anna have been involved with as well is great explanatory text for that. So please do have a look at that if interested. And really what we wanted to do with our work, why we liked it so much, was these kind of breaking down of mechanisms, context and outcomes would allow us to start thinking about our communities in different ways. But really, just to say really quickly, we didn't really spend too much time on this stuff. We kind of didn't want to spend now at the end of the work, we have done this, but the key thing for us was what works for whom, beyond what works for whom, what circumstances, and what respect. That was a key thing, and all our evaluation is built around that exercise, which will give you the kind of data collection you need, the mechanisms and context and outcomes and so on. And we felt that was a nicer way of talking to people as well, and explaining it to stakeholders and making sure they understand what we're doing and so on. So really, that's why we want to do, rather than just saying what works and generalizing from that, we wanted to try and go away from one size fits all approaches, be a bit more nuanced how we took it on. So that's why we did it, and I'm really glad that Gemma came across it and did it, because I think it's really helped the work in particular. And this is something which will be very familiar to all of you who do realism work. Again, just a small explanation. I'm going to come back to this a bit later on and flesh it out with our own example of it. But this is kind of the idea behind this. We have on the kind of outside circle some kind of contextual factor. We have our intervention here coming across. We have a mechanism which is an intersection of reasonings and resources. So we introduce a resource, we see how we shift reasonings and so on, and then we see what kind of patterns of outcomes occur as a result. And essentially, if our context change, or if our reasonings shift, or something happens, we can start coming up with an explanation as to why a certain mechanism, as to why a certain initiative overall has activated or not. So a nice way to think about this is, did it work or not? Why didn't it work? And this helps us elucidate that in particular, and that's what we wanted to do with it. And later on, I'll come back to how we tried to build this in a bit more with our work as well. The reason, as I said before, the reason why I like this so much is the contextual focus of it. I think, Nick, when I spoke to Camel, a colleague who's helped me with this at Leeds in the realism, he said this to me. He said it's about context, because I was struggling with it a bit, and I was like, how do I figure this out? And Nick, as he always does, explained it so well. He said it's just about context. Just think about the context. That's all this is. And once we made that kind of discovery, we were able to really start pinpointing some of these things a bit more. Ray, in a chapter of that book in 2018, talks about this really well. Context can be multidimensional. They can mean different things, locations, individuals. They can be reconstructed in different ways. They can be both physical and they can have sociological meaning. And with that in mind, that allows us to start actually really putting together a bit of a picture as to what's happening in our multifaceted areas. Again, come back to the question of an effective way of explaining these existing gaps. That's what we wanted to do. So finally, sorry, I'll get on to the work now. Me blagging on. So excuse me. But what we tried to do here, I've got two parts of this. There's two papers I'm going to present in 10-15 minutes. So I apologize in advance, but there's going to be two parts to this. I'm going to talk about WP in the community, which is one paper we did, and WP in schools and colleges was the other paper we did. And basically, I'll come back to the methods a bit later on. I'm just going to run through them so we can just have a chat about it. I thought it might be a bit better, just kind of open it up a little bit. And what we wanted to talk about here is basically our staff, our outreach staff. We put some of them into schools and colleges, others we put into the community space to do that type of work in particular. And this allowed us to do different things in different spaces, to think about different types of initiative and so on. We used a theory called Centerplace, David Creswell's quite nice work, 2009 work. And we based it on realist interviews with outreach staff, and our ones in school, very similar kind of self in some aspects, but we just looked at it in schools. And we basically did realist focus groups and realist interviews with management as well. So I'll go through the community stuff first, then I'll run through the next part of it after that. And in particular, what we started to think about with the community side of it, which is the part of it which I found the most fun in some aspects, because we were able to do really fun WP. We started to think about how context could help us elucidate how WP was meant to work in distinct community spaces. So things like using sense of place, getting a sense around the community, its setting, young people's sense of belonging, a lot of kind of the sociology around kind of youth and space and place. We kind of use some of that work, kind of immersion and involvement between people and place. Oh, cheers, Mark. Thank you. I'll run through this bit. And then we tapped into those social relations that is inhabited daily. How can we use this knowledge in a way that kind of helped us? And this is kind of what we want to do quite a lot of. Featherstone, which is a little village near Wakefield, huge fans of rugby league. So we did lots of work in regard to Featherstone Rovers Club, set up stalls, spoke to people using it, and this helped us kind of engage people from the community setting and so on. We did all sorts of stuff like this, things like creative art projects, individual interventions, so mentoring in a community setting, which is a bit different from formalised settings. Working with local groups where we could, we couldn't do that everywhere. Set information stores in the right areas and so on. We did photography projects, we worked with local employers, the usual stuff. The idea being that we could create bespoke and community focused activities tailored to the needs of young people in the communities in particular. And this allowed, I think, in the analysis of some of the work, some nice things. As Centerplace was a middle range theory, we could have a nice platform for innovating WP in different ways. If we kind of establish that kind of Centerplace, using that as a kind of as a general kind of as a general theory to go forward, we can pave the way for more serious conversations that build trust. So we did stuff like an outrageous activity, so have outrageous activity, start having conversations around things that are interesting in the community, and then you can start talking about HG and what that is in a way that more respectful than kind of going in there with a sledgehammer. And this allowed us to kind of reposition our work to be more community focused. And building more quality relationships, we saw kind of increased program mechanisms around that. And this helped us avoid this one-size-fits-all approach that didn't account for different contexts, and we could see better outcomes as a result. However, I just need to note quite quickly, WP became quite challenging outside of charities that could help us get there. So it wasn't all great. When we could do it, it worked. There were times we couldn't because of those contextual constraints. The second paper I'm going to talk about is schools and colleges. This is one I just talked about just before. This is where we put our staff in schools and colleges. And really the idea behind this was to kind of facilitate a change in culture within schools to introduce DWP. And we wanted to use a risk evaluation to show how we were doing this. Our HEPO staff, we call them boundary spanners. They have a broad ranging relationship in regards to how we go about those things. They are essentially kind of groups that that kind of arrange quite a lot of work. Oh, sorry, is that Andrew? Sorry, I didn't. Yes, I can. Sorry, thank you. That came across examining the work around how we could use community spaces. One of the things about Centerplace, it allows us to really think through these kind of complexities a bit more. So yeah, thank you. I'll come back to that a bit later on, Andrew, if that's okay, just so I can finish the presentation. I'll try and explain it a bit more if you don't mind. And basically, yeah, we then tried to think about the ways in which we could do this in the schools and colleges as well, building relationships, improving WP, thinking through these kind of questions as well, and how we could obviously improve outcomes ultimately. You know, getting them to AG, which is what we want to get to in the end. And with that, I'll just move forward a bit. We have a slight logic model. I'm going to talk about. I'll come back later on, so I'll get through this a bit later. Here's our rough logic model, what we put into the processes, our outputs, our outcomes, and we wanted to try and build in this kind of cultural change, which is very challenging to do. And with that in mind, middle range theory became very useful for us. We did this through analysing great literature and speaking to staff as well, but it shed light on the spectrum of role of HEPs and staff in schools. As these are activities, they comprise spatial networks, connections, and locations. They could allow us to do not just kind of introduce physical resources, but also do something about the social relations in that space as well, which is quite. And this really helped us try to kind of articulate our narrative of the work, you know, why we're doing this. And in the end, we kind of had this Centerplace as our middle range theory. This allowed us to increase volume of WP, more targeted WP, more bespoke WP, increase organizational familiarity, and normalize the HEPA rule. And especially in sites where it worked, where we could do that. It didn't work everywhere for other reasons, which I'll go to in a moment. Where it worked, it kind of had great impacts in terms of partnership working, better in terms of bespoke delivery, and we could see them responding to this resource. So we could see these reasoning start to shift, which is great. Where it didn't always work was down to where Centerplace didn't happen so easily because of organizational and institutional complications. Head teachers not always realizing how to use these staff, for instance. Sometimes, you know, just not quite always kind of getting things in place. So just things like that. Other times, clear tensions between careers and HE, the different narratives that we were trying to negotiate. And lastly, another barrier we found was the lack of community engagement outside of things. We could do things in the school or college, but not always do things outside of that. So with that in mind, what we kind of felt at the end for these two approaches was the importance of bringing them together a little bit. And Centerplace on its own is a partial thing. It doesn't do much in schools or colleges about the community, and vice versa. You can't do the community stuff about the schools and colleges. You need to be quite comprehensive in how you approach it. And our risk evaluation, I hope what it's done is enhance that a little. So this also allows us to kind of think about what our needs are of our learners and not kind of go in with these deficit model approaches, which you see quite a lot in WP sometimes. So what I tried to do is bring this all together a little bit in one of those big, huge logic models that might be nonsense, but I'm hoping it'll make some degree of sense. And like before, when we have our reasoning resources kind of spectrum, we have our mechanisms. Cheers, Mark, thank you. I shouldn't be too long now, thank you. What we have here is the first particular kind of barrier is our schools and colleges, and our second one, our community. And what we wanted to kind of emphasize here was the multidimensional nature of context, essentially. Through that, we could see when we get the school and colleges stuff right, that's great. We can see things happening. We can change cultures in schools and colleges. But if we can't change it in the community, then you run into kind of issues in terms of outcome, and vice versa. If you get things right in the community, you've also got to think about how it works in the institutional spaces as well. And if you don't kind of bring these things together, you kind of have a complication. And this meant that, you know, you could do lots of stuff in the institution. We don't do anything about distrust of higher education more broadly in the community space, such as places in Wakefield where we had some of those issues. You wouldn't be able to actually get to the outcomes that you want, which is finding tailored support for young people in the institutions and a wider community itself. So this is just a bit of a rough approximation. And I kind of was thinking about this yesterday, how I could build a narrative between these two things. And I think that's a key point. In the papers, we talk about separate things, but it's quite clear now, looking back at this, that they're both mutually reinforcing, and that's a key point to note. Okay, final slide before I finish. The contextual kind of discussion we want to think about here is what happens on a similar date in Whitby is not the same as happens on a day in York, which is a great way of thinking about race innovation. As I said before, these mutually reinforcing approaches helps us to achieve what we want in terms of these outcomes. Where we didn't see that, we can explain where it was a bit more difficult. Visualization, for those that are new to it, I think is an amazing project, an amazing approach. I think people should use it in all sorts of different social policy domains. And I think these questions about what works for whom and what circumstances and what respect and how is really key. And for us in this instance, I think the final point just to note on is it allows us to engage community spaces, to situate the circumstances where WP works, and allows for more in-depth and nuanced explanations about the efficiency of WP as well. I'll leave that there. Thank you so much for that, everyone. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Adam. That was great as a really detailed and deep dive into the kind of complex policy area that you're working with. So we've had some questions that have come into the chat. I'm just going to see if I can get these. Yeah. Could you explain how you identified and selected the Centerplace? That's gone then. Centerplace middle range theory.
Yeah, thank you. This was the hardest part of this, actually, and thank you for asking, Andrew, because I struggled with this. I was a bit like, you know, this evaluation is it's great in many ways, but getting used to it in this way, I found challenging. God, he's left the session. Oh well, I'll explain anyway. Middle theory can be one of the things I found it was hard to find, and what I did actually in the end was I looked at a lot of literature around space and place, because obviously we're thinking about communities and knowledge and belonging and so on. Basically, Centerplace seemed to be the most effective kind of platform to look at some of the other theories we wanted to look at. So in the end, it was a choice that we made to do based on something that we could hang some of the other kind of areas on, if that made sense, and that allowed us to do that quite nicely. So it was more about thinking. Going through the literature, finding it that way is how we did it. And then once we got that, it all opened up. It really helped, actually. It was a thing that made the project work so well. Well, I hope it worked so well anyway. So yeah, that answered your question.
Great. So the next question came from Virginia, who said, "Thanks, Adam, for the presentation. I'm extremely interested in complexity and realist evaluation and evaluation generally. So the question is, you mentioned that you work on capturing complexity in WP practice, policy in underrepresented communities across the region. Could you please elaborate more on what aspects of complexity you were working on and how this was done? Many thanks."
Definitely, yeah. So one of the things that when we say complexity, one of the things we're thinking about in this context is the varying explanations as to why young people might not, for whatever reason, go to higher education. And the kind of issue we had when the government did this analysis, they identified these gaps. Some of it was what you would expect as a social scientist. You had the kind of questions of more deprived, marginalized communities, and the kind of I guess lesser HE inclusion and so on and so forth. Some of it though was quite strange. We saw some things come that were what we didn't expect. For instance, where communities where you would expect based on their GCSEs, but nonetheless they still weren't going to higher education. And this allowed us this is where we started thinking, well, what's going on here? So the aspects we're talking about then became around race and gender and ethnicity and class, and we used those things. And I'm sorry, I've not really talked about some of those things here, just to kind of get through all the work a bit. But these are the things that we kind of were thinking about. Things like, you know, how you see yourself. Neil Harrison's done some fantastic work on possible selves. Thanks, Andrew. Sorry about that. And how young people see themselves in their communities and how it might change based on where they've grown up, basically. So these are some of the things that we wanted to look at and we started to think about a little bit more. And hopefully in the paper we kind of do a bit more to explain some of that. So that's the answer to that. And the process we followed for the search for literature for other stakeholders. When Gemma set this up, one of the first things Gemma did was basically do a load of focus groups with practitioners, and as well as doing all the kind of literature researching, we've got a lot of people with knowledge around WP, lots of staff who've worked in these areas. First thing we did was speak to them, did a load of focus groups, get a sense of program theories, and just to explain this is part of a much bigger project. This is just a community side of it, but we have kind of program theories that we kind of engage with, and that's how we use the stakeholders to kind of formulate our program theories, and community was a big part of that going forward initially. So and now we're kind of at a point where we're rethinking them again. You know, we're kind of because we've got a year left, kind of now thinking about how we can move forward with them a little bit too. So I hope that answers your question there, Demi. Thank you so much for asking. It's really appreciate it.
Cheers, Adam. There's another one here from Demi who says, thanks for your presentation. Particularly interested in the process of identifying initial program theories in the form of middle range theories. Could you direct me to a paper where I can read more about the ways in which you did that in your project? For example, why sense of place over other mid-range theories was selected? What's the process you followed while searching the literature before talking to the stakeholders?
So I think, sorry, Mark, I think I just answered. I've answered the wrong question. I think I answered Demi's question just before, just now. So I can do that again. But I think I must have missed off Virginia's question. And apologies. I'll come back to Virginia's question. I didn't mean to miss that one off.
Virginia's question was more about.
There was a bit of figuring out these things and refining our models and so on. But Centerplace allowed us to examine a broader range of things in a sense, and that's why we chose it in the end. So yeah, that's why we did that.
Okay, we got one from Emily, which says, thanks, Adam. Did you encounter any challenges disaggregating between contexts and mechanisms?
Yes, I dream about that, to be honest with you. I have nightmares about context mechanisms. Yeah, all the time. And actually, I mean, Joe Greenhall and others have got great work on this. There's kind of complexity being disaggregating these things are always messy. For us, it was a bit more straightforward because we kind of split up mechanisms and context a little bit more explicitly. Contexts were essentially related to the different types of feature of schools and colleges. So we could really kind of pinpoint things there that were a bit more straightforward for us. Mechanisms were more focused on the kind of questions of reasoning resources, the interactions people had in these kind of spaces. So it was those two things that allowed us to think of those things. And
I'll go with Tina's first. I'll read out Tina's and then we'll let Ray go in. So Tina said, really interesting presentation, Adam. In one of your diagrams, you separated out the factors such as context interventions and mechanisms. How do you deal with factors that were in fact integral, even though they were separated out in your diagram?
I think we just made a choice about it, to be honest, in the end. We looked at it as best we could, you know, and ultimately, the challenging thing is, right, like, for us, we started to realize that if we go so far into mechanisms and context discussions, that we were just going to get lost in it. So we broadened it out, we looked at it a bit more sparingly, and that allowed us to open it up a bit more, to be honest. So it wasn't something we concerned ourselves too much about, if that made sense, if I'm honest. And although there is a need to think about these things a little bit, there's also a need to kind of just think about what works, how it works, and that's how we did it. Now, fair enough, we could have gone further, you know. I do think that's very true, actually, but we also, if we had more quantitative outcome data, could have mapped some of this work onto outcomes too, which we needed to do, actually. And I think the future work will be doing that a bit more. that'll hopefully also allow us to separate out some of the kind of things that you're talking about there as well. So yeah, hopefully that'll make sense and stuff like that. Thank you.
Great stuff. May, did you have a question?
Yes. Well done, Alan. Nice work. It was very kind of you to include me as one of the personnel on the project. I think I was involved for 5 minutes, but thank you anyway.
I'm glad you were right.
My question is I'd like you to say a little bit more about some of the results. You never have time to talk about results in presentations like this. And the most interesting thing for me was that you are attempting to tackle the for whom question at the ward or community level. And I think that's pretty unusual. Going back a bit, the first evaluation I ever did was a widening participation one, and it was about prisoner education, and so I tackled the for whom question at the individual level, and came up with many surprises. So the prisoners who benefited and went straight were not the ones we expected. I was surprised, and we tried to characterize the individuals in language you probably wouldn't use these days. So there were the plodders, they were the poor, they were the ineffective criminals, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in your sunny Scarborough and windy Wetherby, etc. If you've got time, can you tell us? Can you try and characterize some of the characters and characterize some that surprised you, maybe?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you so much, Ray. That's a really good way of putting it, actually. So the thing about there are kind of expectations that you have at WP where you think this should work in these as you said, these things should work in these settings. And what we found, what we assumed would work in these settings were stuff around getting people into schools and colleges, because that would change cultures. But then we soon found that the community aspect was really important, and actually we simply couldn't maybe do some of the work we wanted to do without having that other side of it. So there was another kind of question entirely about that for us, and the kind of some specific examples, Ray, just to kind of talk them through a little bit. And thank you, you're right, I think the outcomes of this, so let's just try and through it at the end there. But things like in Wakefield, for instance, we didn't expect taking the antagonism to be such a major factor, actually, if I'm honest. And then it was like, well, we need to do something in the community space about that, about speaking to parents and so on. Things like Bradford, where parental kind of influences were quite key as well. We started to kind of pinpoint our initiatives, because this is ultimately a process evaluation, much more targeted, feeding back into that a little bit more to try and think about ways that we could shift the practice, getting stuff back to practitioners and so on. So some of those kind of outcomes of tailoring support, so on, ideally this is what you want, but the challenge that we had, the kind of pattern we kind of saw was we could do 1 and 2, both of these things, kind of school and the community, we could get it all to work. As soon as we took one of those out, it got more complicated and more messy. And I think someone does a lot of outreach work in community spaces and thinks a lot about it, and thinks a lot about sense of place and all that type of stuff. I think that's a really key point to note, that we can't perhaps do the things we want to do without having the kind of infrastructure there to make it all work. The one example I was really surprised at was in remote localities, like charities and youth clubs and stuff like that. So that meant that you couldn't kind of latch on to any kind of institutional support to try and get to young people and so on, or parents and so on. So that's why you have these hard to access areas as a result of those things. So those are the things which really I would say I would stress quite explicitly. In the paper, I go through some more micro outcomes, a bit more detailed about the institutions and the school college side of it too. And in that regard, we found that it was really about organisational structures. If the school and college was set up for WP, they were much happier to make it all work. If it was new, it was a bit of a battle for our staff at first to try and change things. Obviously, it was challenging for us to negotiate as well. But at least we could pinpoint more resources, and we could say, right, let's give more help to this person and so on, and do more of that. So yeah, that's kind of, I hope that kind of explains some of that a little bit more. The one weakness of this paper, I think, is the outcomes is, I think, the weakest part of it, because we haven't got quant data, and I'd like to see how this works in light of that. And I think the future work, as I mentioned before, will hopefully start giving more of an answer there as well, Ray, more of a fuller answer to some of those things that you're asking about. I think that's what we need to kind of elaborate it a bit more.
That's splendid, Adam. Just last point. You put a picture of Featherstone Rovers on, and you probably didn't notice I was there in the crowd.
Really?
No.
There's another question that's coming from Greg, Adam, but I'm going to take some chair's privilege in before I ask that one. One of my own, and it's slightly, I suppose, related to the question that Ray just asked. It's more to do with it. Was there any sort of sense that there was an issue around community, but from the point of view of the community that the researchers were coming from, and then coming from rather than going to? The access. So when I worked at Leeds, I used to do quite a bit of this sort of outreach work, going into schools in like Castleford and colleges in Pontefract and Halifax and Huddersfield, and the satellite towns as they probably are. But there was always a sense when we did it that Leeds wasn't for them, wasn't for these students, and I think it was partly because of the what they had about the community that we were coming from.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a really great question, actually, and that's something we certainly found in the work quite a lot. And to be honest with you, I half expected it, like, because like a little bit, but I was surprised how powerful it was, if that makes sense. Just how much it shifted. There's a paper by a colleague called Neil Harrison. He's done lots of work in this area, and he talks about something called particle cells, basically. And obviously psychological theory, but he's kind of repositioned it for WP a little bit. And he talks about this idea that if you don't have an example of uni in your life when you're growing up, what are you going to think about it when someone like us, Mark, goes in from the Uni of Leeds, says, oh, here's what we do, and we do this thing called sociology, and they look at you a bit like, well, and Neil's work's fantastic in all sorts of ways, but one of the things I really like about it is that it explains some of that kind of conflict and tension. And this means that it's very difficult. One of the things we're talking about now in our work is role models as a mechanism. And what we found with other work outside of the community stuff, a bit of the community stuff, but just across the board, is when we get role models that are closer to their lived experiences, that have come from the same communities, and our HEPs usually did, I might add, our HEPs usually did come from Bradford, or there's usually some locality that we always try to add in. That worked a lot better because it allowed us to close those gaps in space. And I think there's a need to reflect on how higher education repositions itself in communities, to be more inclusive to them, to be, as you know, Mark, at Leeds I taught the foundation year for 3 years, which I loved doing, and sorry, just to explain, the foundation year was a kind of pre-year for first year students before they came to the Uni of Leeds that I was involved. And I always got that sense from them, that kind of like, oh, we don't like this, we're not sure about it. And it's hard to get around that. And this is why I guess we need to think about these multiple contextual ways that we can try to try and talk to people about these things. But yeah, I think it's really difficult. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to your question. I wish I did. But yeah, I think you're really right. And I can completely agree from my experiences.
No, that's great. Thanks, Adam. So Greg, probably got the time for this one. So Greg has said, how did the WP practitioners you work with at Go Higher West Yorkshire respond to this as an approach to evaluating the programme, particularly involving them in the theory building side of things?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. This is this is the hardest part of it, right? And I was chatting to Anna yesterday, actually, just before this presentation, and we're talking. This is just the reevaluation of projects. Like, there's so much going on, and you almost like just roll with it and make it. Basically, there is this kind of need sometimes to think, how on earth do you get this back into practice a little bit? So I think it's a really good question, Greg. Actually, it's the one thing we struggle with, I think, a little. Not blame anyone. It's just hard to do. You've got to do the work, write the reports, do the evaluation, figure out context, mechanism, outcomes, all that stuff, build the theories up, and then go back to your practitioners and say, we found this, and then get them to shift practice. And that means training and CPD, I think, and actually, as you say, something we probably need to do a bit more of, getting them involved as a theory building side of things, which is something I think we could do in the future a bit more. And what we tended to do is just kind of get it all in and analyze it, and that can be problematic. We want it to be the practitioners who have this, you know, and so on. So I think it's a really good question, and I don't know what other people who do process evaluations, how they negotiate these tensions, because it's the most challenging. I found that personally the most challenging part of it, because it can be difficult to do. What we tend to do is have big staff meetings. We go through it. With COVID, it's a bit more complex, but we try our best just to show what people are doing and try and shift practices, and then kind of target communities where we have the analysis to back up our assertions. So that's how we try to do it. But it's a really good point, Greg. And again, I don't have an answer to that, and I think it's something I need to think about as well a little bit. Thank you so much for the question. What we're doing here is being stipulated by the government for this like year 9 to year 13. So that's where the money is a little bit. But you're absolutely right. A lot of WP works way before that, and it needs to, for the reasons that you just stipulated, that you need to work with young people. Generally, what we find is if you work with people at year 8, it's evidence-based, of course. In all fairness to them, they have thought about it. Year 9, things get more effective. But having said that, I think earlier could be quite a good way of doing it as well, especially the community side of it, because these things take such a long time to do. So yeah, that's an absolutely great point, and I think we do need to think about that as well. Although I will just add, not every person wants to go to HG, and there's other options too. I don't want to force that agenda on them, but there's that as well. So that you can think about too. I hope that
lots of interest being generated in getting hold of your papers, Adam. That's in the chat. So hopefully we can access that after the session.
I'll send them out to people. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for listening as well, everyone. It's really appreciated.